Stacy constantly cursed fate for how long she had to die. It all started with mild ailments, which she did not attach importance to, but then noticed that she was getting weaker. Previously, work had brought her pleasure, but now by the end of the day, she felt completely exhausted and went to bed as soon as she came home. Then Stacy took a vacation and went to rest with her husband. But there she only got worse and had to go to the doctor. So, she learned a disappointing diagnosis. Although at first, she was still told that it was possible to recover. It would just be long and difficult. Over time, the doctors became increasingly gloomy. She had few relatives by blood, and she was far away, so she began to communicate with her friends less and less, and even her husband distanced himself. She understood it wasn't easy for him either, but that didn't make her any less bitter. The slow decline was painful for her. She would much rather accept a quick death than prolong her days month after month. She began to walk with a cane, slowly, like an old woman. And then the day came when her legs refused. The very next day, her husband Brian began to persuade her to go to the hospital, although the doctor said there was no difference whether she would be there or at home. Stacy wanted to stay at home, and yet she let herself be persuaded. Maybe at least it would be easier for him. But every day it became increasingly unbearable to stay there. And when the doctor said that she had a week or two left, no more, she still asked to go home. Brian stood in the hospital corridor and watched his sick, dying wife being loaded into an ambulance. He looked after her and did not want to believe that such a burden would fall on his shoulders. He stared and stared until the doctor's voice pulled him out of his heavy thoughts. Brian looked at the elderly, cheerful man in a white coat and did not understand the words. The doctor seemed to move his lips without any sound, and Brian unsuccessfully tried to make out what he was saying. The doctor looked sternly at the patient's husband, as if realizing that he did not understand the words he said. "Can you hear me? Good. Look, we did everything we could. Your wife is dying. So let her spend her last days with the man who loves her. Just be with her. She doesn't ask for more. And who knows? Maybe God will have mercy. It's not for nothing that her name is Stacy," the doctor said. He paused for a moment and continued. "I would advise you not to hire a nurse, because she has a couple of weeks left at most." The doctor left, and only the smell of medicines remained hanging in the air like a disembodied spirit. Brian looked back towards the ambulance. They were waiting for him. Then everything happened as if in a terrible dream. A man watched as a car drove up to his high-rise building, brought his wife into the apartment, and placed her on the bed. 2 hours had passed since his sick, dying wife had been brought to his apartment. Brian could not come to terms with this. "Brian, my dear, come to me," the wife pleaded hoarsely, but he did not come. "Thank you, my dear, for taking me and sheltering me. I so want to die next to you in our apartment, where we were happy." She coughed heavily with some deep, gurgling sound. He covered his ears with his palms and plopped down on the chair with force, and it creaked loudly. He wanted to respond, but he couldn't. Brian spread out the sofa and went to bed, hoping that his wife would not survive the stress of the trip and would die by morning. But his hopes were not destined to come true. Brian woke up an hour before the alarm clock, and he made himself a coffee and went into the bedroom. His wife was sleeping, still breathing. For some reason, this fact angered him so much that he barely restrained himself from screaming. He was shaking all over with anger. Brian stormed into the kitchen and threw the mug against the wall with all his might. The brown liquid flowed in a large stain over the floor tile, on which not a single scratch was found. He exhaled heavily and began to cry. He was sitting on a chair, and tears of impotence and hopelessness were quietly flowing from his eyes. It was so good when she was finally admitted to the hospital. He could start a new life. He was so deeply immersed in his own thoughts that he shook with indignation and anger. He quickly caught himself when the doorbell rang and hurried to the door and opened it. "What took you so long?" A young beauty was standing there impatiently, holding 2 large glasses of to-go coffee in her hands. "Hush! They brought mine back," Brian quickly said in a whisper. He looked around anxiously, although he understood that his wife would not be able to get up on her own. He stared at the young mistress, who shrugged her shoulders and entered the apartment as if nothing had happened. She took root here during the time that Brian's wife was in the hospital. The girl went into the kitchen. Brian was so angry. "What are you doing?" "You said she was very sick, that she was dying, so she wouldn't get up. Come here, I've missed you," the girl, whose name was Jody, said quickly in a loud whisper, snuggling up to the man. She kissed him with such fervor that he could not resist. When they finished, he had to go to his wife's bedroom, sending the girl to the shower to continue there with her. The husband brought his wife a glass of water, gave her pills, and went into the shower, continuing to have fun. That's where they came up with a plan to get rid of his wife. He was looking forward to being alone with this beauty soon and being able to do whatever he wanted again. After all, his wife would leave him all the wealth, and she was far from poor since she had been working all this time. After her death, he and the new woman will not have to work at all. The girl left, leaving Brian alone with his dying wife. He began to collect her things. Brian packed a full bag and dragged it into the car. Having laid out the back seat in the car, he covered it with a thick blanket and then returned to the apartment and immediately went to his wife. She literally lit up with happiness when she saw him. "My dear, how I missed you. How good it is that you are next to me," the woman said, barely smiling, as she didn't have enough strength for anything else. "Stacy, listen. I have a friend who will help you. If we have no hope for medicine, then we will heal ourselves. I'll take you to a healer now, and he'll help you." Brian lied briefly on the move, trying not to look into her dull, almost colorless eyes. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her to the car. She weighed almost nothing. Her body seemed to consist of nothing but bones. Brian was disgusted even to hold her in his arms, and nausea came to his throat from the smell of pills that soaked through her skin. He put her in the back seat, covered her with a blanket, and got behind the wheel. He started the car and drove away from the city. They drove for more than 4 hours until they found themselves in a deep forest. He wanted to throw her right in the woods at first, but then he caught sight of an abandoned old house that apparently belonged to a gamekeeper or some local hermit. Brian took his wife in his arms and carried her into the house. He left her on the big bed and left without saying a word. Stacy knew he was leaving her in this old house. She understood that her husband would not come back. He laid her on the bed, and tears of despair and understanding ran from her eyes that she would die of hunger, here, all alone. She looked at him, but Brian averted his eyes. He also understood that everything had become clear to her. Brian left, started his car, and disappeared into the distance. Stacy was lying on a huge bed and crying, unable to turn around or get up. Her mouth soon dried up, and her whole body began to ache, and she really needed to use the bathroom, but no one else would help her. Stacy fell into oblivion, then woke up again, but at some point, she realized that she was not alone in the house. "Here, have a drink. It will make you feel better," said a man whose face was blurring before her eyes. Stacy took a few sips but couldn't go any further. Then the man lifted her head with a big hand and helped her finish the drink. She fell asleep again. Stacy woke up much later, and that's when she saw that some man with a beard was watching her. He came up to her, smiled, and said, "Good morning. You've finally come to your senses. And I've always said nature heals everything." She had never felt this good in the last 4 years of her illness. There was no pain, and everything cleared up in her eyes. She even felt that she could breathe deeply. "My husband brought me here because he wanted to leave me. The doctors refused me, and then my husband. I thought I was going to die here alone," Stacy admitted a bit haphazardly. "You won't die. Now you definitely won't die since the drugs help. I've been taking care of you for 2 months. I kept thinking that you wouldn't pull through, but you clung to life as best you could. That's it. Now you won't fall into such oblivion. You'll see. You'll be back on your feet in a couple of weeks. Just don't be afraid. I have a dog, and he slept with you all the time here at the foot of the bed. You may not remember him, but he's kind and good. His name is Dick. He stayed with you when I went to the forest," the man said with a smile. "Your husband is a scumbag. Marriages are made in heaven. God has sent you this test." "Excuse me, but why do you live in the forest?" suddenly asked Stacy, who decided to change the subject. "Me? I became a beggar, fired from work, and the bank took the house. I had to beg in the city, and there I met Dick. And then he went into the woods and led me to this house. I have established relationships with local villagers. I help them with household chores for groceries. That's how I got settled, and I've been living here for 2 years. I would be glad to return to society, but I have neither money nor the opportunity," the man said with a sad smile. They talked until the morning. So week after week went by, and along with gratitude, love blossomed in Stacy's soul. They understood each other without a word. Stacy had never felt so happy, but one day when she was completely stronger, she decided to leave. He let her go, even though he didn't believe she would ever come back. Stacy was too beautiful for him, too well off to spend the rest of her life with a beggar somewhere in the deep woods. He took her to the village, where they took her to the city. Stacy went to her lawyer first, and a real nightmare began. It turned out that her husband had almost registered her as deceased, and there were only a few days left before the verdict of the court was announced. But Stacy made huge efforts to stop it and fought for more than one day. The court's decision was overturned, then Stacy withdrew all the money from her account and bought a good house in a small town with good infrastructure nearby. She repurchased her car that her husband had pawned, but she never showed her face to him. Stacy immediately got behind the wheel and drove to that very remote forest to that house. When the man who had healed her, whose name was Jack, came out, he was happy to see his beloved, who had disappeared for 2.5 weeks. "Get ready, I bought us a house, and bring Dick. There's a big yard there. And don't, Jack, just don't be embarrassed, you saved my life. And I'll give us a new home," she said triumphantly, hugging him. By the evening, they were in a new modern cottage, enjoying every minute spent together. Stacy still did not believe that she had not only survived there in the deep forest, but also met her happiness. When the lawsuit came to Brian in court, he could not believe his eyes. It's been 6 months since he took his wife to die in the woods. He didn't even realize what was going on right away. He appeared in court and was stunned to see a healthy, beautiful wife next to a large, handsome man who hugged her like a hefty bear, and against his background, Brian seemed like a puny reed. The divorce thundered for Brian like a bolt from the blue. He looked at the court order and did not believe that he remained a beggar. His wife's account, his wife's apartment, even the old country house belonged to his wife, and he was left without a job, without an education, absolutely unfit for independent life. Naturally, Jody left him a long time ago, having found a more satisfying place. He rushed from his place to his wife to beg for forgiveness. But a hefty man overshadowed the fragile Stacy. Brian did not dare to act, and he retreated, seeing off the beautiful couple. It was all over. Brian was so happy when he finally left his wife to die in the woods. He was so happy having fun with his young and beautiful mistress. He thanked fate every day for such a wonderful plan. And now what? Now he would have to go back to his mother and live with her until he got his life back on track. Brian soberly assessed the situation and understood that he would not be able to get settled and would rely on his mother. It was a late, warm summer evening. Stacy was sitting on a wide bench in the garden, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. He was hugging her, holding her close, and Stacy felt sure she had never been so happy. Stacy looked at her future husband and thanked him for saving her life. If it weren't for him, she would have died there in the woods. He looked at her and thanked her for her love, for the house, for a new job, and for happiness. If it weren't for her, he would have spent years alone in the forest. It was as if they were sent to each other by fate. The lovers were sitting in the garden, inhaling the scent of herbs after the rain. They just enjoyed each other and were happy that they could be together.